one tonight from a professor who has a kind of hard time here with us, because instead of telling you in class what he thinks, he can only do it by wearing the mask of Martin Heidegger, and he hates me for that. But hopefully in the evening of this lecture, that's different. Today we will hear him, and I'm always looking forward to that. And surprisingly for me, I always are so near to his thoughts, and we only meet here in Saas-Fee, never everywhere else. So this is a moment in which I'm looking forward not to criticize afterwards, so just say, very well done, Chris Fynsk.
You're tempting me to pull out a text on Heidegger and just go with that. So, this is an essay, which is it's a sketch. It's a beginning. It's not very developed. And in some respects, there's kind of an autobiographical question there. But it is perhaps not without relation to things that have brought some of you here. So I hope that it will be pertinent in that respect. It has a slightly autobiographical dimension, in part because it's written for someone whom I can't name because this is for a Festschrift and I don't want them to find out. So anyway, I can't name the individual. But the reason I allowed a certain autobiographical side to it was that I was writing to someone in that way. The topic is Europe, and the title is Thinking in Europe. So, it's a sort of light fare after dinner, but I hope that it will be perhaps engage some of the thoughts that have brought some of you here. So I want to take my point of departure from a sentiment regarding Europe that has accompanied me for over 3 decades of study and professional life. A sentiment, an inclination, actually I hesitate over its designation. Is it perhaps a mere prejudice that I have learned in the course of my studies, an unfounded bias that I would have picked up from long exposure to markedly Eurocentric academic cultures? Or is it more profoundly anchored in the discipline to which I have devoted myself, perhaps even linked to its very essence, and thus an intuition or a sentiment of a truer kind? Can it thus be called an experience of philosophy, and thus worthy of a philosophical meditation? Or, finally, is it more fundamentally an experience of a site, or a set of sites, or perhaps an ethos that has appeared in Europe in recent decades by reason of a particular engagement with language in the circles in which I've moved? So, a particular engagement with language, using this term ethos in the manner Heidegger proposed in his letter on humanism. I will not try to give more than a provisional articulation of this sentiment, and will phrase it as simply as possible. The philosophical legacy to which I devote my work, let us call this legacy post-Heideggerian, remains tied to Europe in such a way that it makes best sense to pursue that work here. I must add immediately that this is a sentiment that I have not borne lightly or without struggle. I am deeply suspicious of it. In the mid-1980s, I left an academic post in France and returned to the US with the conviction that if I were to devote myself to that elusive thing called thought, I would best do it in my own language and in a struggle for philosophical concreteness in circumstances where the health of my native political and cultural institutions was at stake. There were events in the ensuing years, successes, I suppose, that gave me heart and matched anything I've known in Europe, and I see my work with William Haver in that regard. But in the course of almost 2 decades, I was also aware of a growing sense of failure, manifest in an increasing detachment from professional associations or even publishing. I could not be sure of the sources of this feeling and preferred to practice a kind of Leotardian endurance rather than admit that the work I was attempting had little or no place in that place. To this day, I hesitate to draw any firm conclusions from my experience, and I prefer to think that I simply did not find the proper measure, the proper style, the proper address, or even simply the thing itself. But in the past several years, and in response to an invitation to return to Europe, I'll call Scotland Europe. It lends itself more to Europe than does England, so I think it's okay. So in the past several years, and in response to an invitation to return to Europe, after 20 years of stubborn repatriation, I have found my old sentiment returning to me like a challenge. And I have to wonder, is there perhaps some ground to believing that as a thinker in the post-phenomenological tradition, I am more at home here in Europe than in any other site I've known in my academic life, a set of institutions in North America? I'm not certain what my reaction would be should the answer prove positive, since I'm not at all sure that Heimlichkeit is such a good thing in philosophy. In fact, I would prefer to believe that what impels me to thought is a kind of exile. Moreover, I bear a deep resistance to the idea that a form of philosophical thought has a proper place. I would want to challenge an assumption that I know is easily formed from the philosophical references I've provided, the assumption that since my very definition of thought has a markedly European provenance and comes from a tradition that has insistently defined itself as European, it will follow that thought will appear more possible to me in Europe. To such a suggestion, I would hasten to respond, well, then I've been mistaken in taking it for thought. For I use the last term to designate an engagement with a transcendental, or as Jacques once tried to say, quasi-transcendental, conditions of experience. Heidegger argued convincingly, I believe, that all thought has its ontic conditions. He never sought to deny those factical grounds. But he also demonstrated that thought is of an ontological character in that it is inherently a practice of the ontological difference. For this reason, there should be no ground for presuming that thought, after Heidegger, belongs properly to Europe, using this name in a manner that retains some geographical reference. No reason to think that the great philosophical gestures we associate with post-Heideggerian thinking should only have their place in Europe, or could only be translated into viable projects in a European context. Whatever the strength of one's stylistic preferences, taste, even a philosophical habitus, molded in years of training and professional activity, a thinking passage beyond national boundaries should be possible. It should even be possible to get by the idea of Europe. So why then do I have the sense that this rather indefinite thing or place called Europe invites thought, lends itself to thought, or even welcomes thought in a particularly compelling way, even from this wandering American? Why do I have the sense that the post-phenomenological thought to which I am devoted is best pursued here? I will not reach anything like an answer to this immense question. I will not even have a chance to pose it properly and reach thereby beyond personal and historical contingencies. The best I can do in current circumstances is approach it and consider a few of its dimensions. And because time has been short for me, I take my start from a path already opened by Gérard Granel in his treatment of Husserl's idea of Europe. I'll be turning here not to Granel's famous, or rather infamous, preface to Husserl's Crisis, a preface in which Granel describes this important late volume as a pure example of Western theoretical paranoia. I turn not to that text, a rather infamous text, but rather to an essay in one of Granel's later volumes entitled Husserl's Europe. This will provide me with a shortcut, but it should not constitute a diversion, because Granel offers, in the essay I want to consider, an argument for the promise of Europe in the matter of thought, asserting, with and after Heidegger, that an essential divergence has occurred between Europe and America as regards the destiny of philosophy. Granel, in short, would give philosophical comfort to the sentiment that so deeply troubles me. So I see no better place to begin what I hope can become a critical self-reflection. Let me begin with Granel's summary of Husserl's theses concerning European humanity and philosophy, the title of one of Husserl's essays, and then concentrate on several points he makes. Granel notes first, and with reference to the theme of European humanity,